So welcome everybody to our Spiritual Awakenings International event. You should all be muted. So if you're not muted, please take a moment and mute yourself. Thank you. And I'm Dr. Yvonne Cason, the president of Spiritual Awakenings International. And I'd like to say hello and welcome. Bonjour et bienvenue. Herzliche willkommen. Grüezi. Hola y buenos dias. Buongiorno. Bon dia. And aloha. Welcome. Welcome to all of you. We're going to start our meeting today with something a little bit different from how we have started our other meetings, in that I'm going to do a short blessing to begin our meeting. So if I could get all of you to just get in a comfortable position and shut your eyes for a moment and center yourself in the way that you do according to your own personal practices of prayer and meditation. And let us mentally share together in the following blessing for our event today. Heavenly Father, Mother God, great creator who is known by many names in many traditions, bless this meeting today. Help us all to be gift instruments of your love, light, and peace on our planet. May thy will be done. Om Shanti, peace. Amen. Thank you, everyone, and welcome. I had greeted you before the blessing in 7 different languages because Spiritual Awakenings International is truly a global international network. We are absolutely delighted that people all over the world are subscribing and showing up at our events. So we would like to invite you now to just write into the chat where it is that you're joining us from today. I am zooming in from Toronto, Canada, and our Vice President, Robert Bear, is zooming in from Oregon in the United States. I know we have someone from England and somebody from Australia. So please write in the chat where you're joining us from. We love to know that. Spiritual Awakenings International is blossoming and growing. We're just delighted. We're currently in 63 countries all over the world on 6 continents. And we have over 2,300 subscribers, which is pretty awesome in just a year and a half. So we are delighted. And today is a very special event because today we are having a special veterans, military, and first responders event in honor of Remembrance Day and Veterans Day, which both occur in November. And we're really delighted to have a retired Navy Captain, Ben Riggs, speaking with us today. But before we get to his introduction, I'm going to invite the Vice President of Spiritual Awakenings International, Robert Bear, to make a few announcements. Robert.
Thank you, Dr. Cason, and welcome everybody. This is a special event for our veterans, military, and first responders. We're so grateful to have Ben Riggs here today. He's going to do a great job. And this is to honor the veterans and on Veterans and Remembrance Day, which was November 11th. Couple of housekeeping things just to remind you. The format of the meeting, everybody's going to be muted with the exception of the speaker. And we're going to have a question and answer period at the end of Ben's talk. And if you could put your questions into the chat, Linda Truax, our secretary, will be monitoring those questions and providing them to Ben at the end. And a couple of persons we have that are tuning in are special to us. We have a couple members on the Spiritual Awakenings International Advisory Board Tamara Calder Richardson is here, and Brian Sackett. I think Tamara's from North Carolina and Brian's from Toronto, Canada. And we just want to welcome Ben and each of you and hope this is just a great event. And one more thing, SAI is a donation-based organization. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. We try to do all these things, and we will try to do them free for everybody. But if you feel like you'd like to donate something to our organization to help us in our operation, please go to our website, www.spiritualawakeningsinternational.org, and click on the donate button. It's a tax deductible donation if you're in the United States. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Linda Truex from Texas.
Hello, dear friends. So I am Linda Truex. I am a retired Army officer. And today we're going to get a chance to hear from a friend of mine, Benjamin C. Riggs. Benjamin Riggs served as a commissioned officer in the United States Navy. He conducted numerous intelligence support missions around the world as a naval flight officer, and then received his naval aviator wings in 1972. He flew the single-piloted A-7 Corsair II attack jet and numerous other aircraft. Later, he was assigned as an assistant air operations officer on the USS Independence. Now retired, U.S. Navy pilot Ben Riggs will be sharing with us what he has learned about STEs in the military, discussing NDEs, from reincarnation to UFOs. Ben served on active duty in the Navy. Things were like alien UFOs, NDEs, and reincarnation were alien in his world, only talked about quietly or in private. The only NDE stories he ever heard were general about service member spouses, never themselves. But later in his career, one of his commanding officers revealed that he believed in reincarnation. That was a signal to Ben that he could share his thoughts a bit more. When he married his wife, an NDE experiencer, the whole subject of spiritually transformative experiences opened up. Using his analytical thinking, he discovered that the preponderance of evidence showed that there was another dimension that existed. He has continued to share with others, and he teaches a course which is called What Happens When We Die. It's with the OLLI program at the University of Rhode Island. But today, he's going to share with us his insights to some of the encounters of special types he encountered during his military service. So I'd like to introduce you to my friend, Benjamin Riggs.
Thank you, Linda, and thank you, Dr. Yvonne Cason, for the honor of having me here. This is kind of a new experience to be talking about this from a military perspective, but it was a part of my life. And I think to put it in a bit of perspective, I should say a little bit about kind of where I come from. I grew up in New England, and my mother was a registered nurse. My father was a doctor, started in internal medicine and switched to psychiatry. Went to school in Massachusetts. And then I went to Boston University, and I started racing cars on the sports car racing circuit and this, that, and the other. I had to give it up. I wanted to be a race driver. I gave it up because I couldn't afford to keep buying new tires every month. And then I got a full-time job at night at the Sheraton Boston Hotel to help put me through my last year or two of college, and decided business was going to be my career. So I graduated in 1968 from BU, and for those of you old enough to remember, the war in Vietnam was hot, and they were drafting everybody who could walk. So I got called up for my Army physical, and they said, you seem fit enough to us. And I thought, my God, I'm going to be carrying a rifle in the jungle, and I'm not doing that. And so I decided I'd do something a little more interesting, and I was able to qualify for the Navy's flight program. And so I went to aviation officer candidate school in Pensacola, Florida, and then I went through flight officer and then naval aviation training and did about 8 years of active duty, during which time I went into my first marriage. And then after that, I stayed in the Naval Reserve all the way through year 26. So I had kind of a mix between active duty and reserve. And reserve, for those of you who know, you stay in the military and you do 1 weekend a month of, in whatever unit you're assigned to, and you do 2 weeks of active duty a year. And you do this until you get kicked out or you retire. Or you get sent to Iraq or something if you're younger. And so I did that, and I had a very interesting experience because I was with people like me. They were business managers, some were test pilots and engineers at Grumman Aerospace, where our unit was. But a lot of them were out in industry and so forth. And that's when I, got a little bit closer to NDEs. But going back to the military experience, I started out navigating in a squadron of C-130s that did stuff that I can't tell you about. But we were out there one night over the Pacific. Over the area above Puerto Rico, in a warning area, which is where other aircraft are not allowed to fly because somebody's doing something dangerous there in the military. And we heard on the radio some Pan Am flight on its way to San Juan had decided to take a shortcut through our warning area down low. And they reported seeing a flying saucer going at a high rate of speed, unquestionably a flying saucer, not connected to anything tearing by in front of them. They were very lucky it didn't hit the airplane. And I heard this and I thought, oh, yeah, I guess that's got to be what it looks like. But it happened to be I was one of the people who was controlling that object that they saw. And they're still telling their grandchildren today they saw a flying saucer. So I thought, well, this probably explains all of these false reports of UFOs. People just don't understand what they saw. And I remember later on the carrier, we had another carrier in our fleet where one night, one evening, it was sort of twilight evening, they were getting followed by something with a bright light that was not normal aircraft. And the ship started making turns to see, is it following us? And the answer is yes, it kept the same bearing on the ship. At which point the captain ordered 2 of the fighters to go off and intercept it. And they went up and up and up and up and up. And then finally one of them radioed back, we figured this out. It's the planet Venus. Which of course, if you looked at it in the early evening sky, can be very bright and not look like your normal stars. So at that point, I was pretty convinced UFOs are just, people who think they saw something, they just don't understand what it really was. And it was quite a while later before I discovered, whoops, maybe that's not the case. I ended up in A7s, and A7s are single piloted, single engine plane, the only ones that were in the Navy at the time. And essentially, I could show you what they look like. But first, I did want to just mention that what I talk about is not connected with any organized religion or religious belief. It's just based on experience and observation. People like us from all cultures and religious backgrounds. And that's how I approach it. And then I'm going to show you the airplane that I flew. Excuse me. And you can see it's not that big. The cockpit's just got one person in it. It's actually pretty fast. I did get mine to be supersonic a couple times just for the hell of it, but it was mostly designed to deliver bombs, rockets, bullets, and I could carry a nuke up to a megaton on this airplane. And so, because we would be alone with that weapon, and we have a 2-man rule, you can never be alone with a nuclear weapon and the ability to fire it. We all had to be specially watched over. Our medical records had to be screened, and they had to know that we weren't subject to things like hallucinations, right? So these airplanes, we flew mostly with another airplane because that way there were two people involved, and we call this a section. A lot of times we fly closer than that. If we were on a bombing mission, it would be usually in a 4-plane formation, something like that. The cockpit of the airplane, as you can see, fairly busy place, and there's a lot of stuff you had to know. And so we got to be very self-reliant, and we learned that you don't make mistakes. Mistakes are very bad. This is actually the cockpit we had was a little bit more modern than this particular one. But that's part of how the culture came to pass. See if I can stop going. Okay, so that's how the airplane worked. Now, when it was on the ship, of course, the ship is got 85 airplanes on it, and you had to fold your wings so that you could fit them all there. And so this is the environment that we operated on. It's a lot of fun to fly on and off an aircraft carrier during the day, and it is definitely not fun to do it at night. That's where some things happened that, to me, that started making me wonder a little bit about fate, about randomness, how much is luck, how much is some sort of a plan. Now, I knew when I was racing cars that I had some really close calls, and people would say to me, "How did you survive? You were pretty damn lucky." And I thought, well, what really is luck? When I was first landing on this carrier with this airplane, during the day, no big deal. I went out there one night, and it was a really dark night, and it was lousy, rainy, thunderstormy weather, and it was starting to come down and practice night landings. And this was my first night landing, and I had been very high, and I was coming down from a very high spot, trying to get on the glide slope. And I was coming down too fast, and I didn't arrest my descent quite fast enough. And they had landing signal officers on the stern, who were watching you and directing you from your squadron, telling you, you're high, low, give a little power, you're a little left of line up, that kind of stuff. And they gave me the wave off signal, which means full power, go around. So I hit full power, brought the nose up just exactly to where it's supposed to be for maximum, acceleration and getting yourself up. Next thing I knew, I was on board. Grabbed the wire and I was on board. Well, the LSOs by then had jumped off the deck into a net beside the airplane, beside the ship, because they thought I was going to crash. And when they got up and looked, they found the mark from my tail hook was 6 inches from the rear of the ship on the deck. So they put me back on the catapult and told me to go back to Pensacola for the night. I think the captain didn't want to see me again on that ship. But I went back, came back the next day, and everybody, it's like I'm some kind of celebrity. Wow, were his eyes big as saucers? Do you realize what happened to you last night and how close you came? Well, no, not really. And then I started thinking about that. People hit the ramp and die on ships. And I said, well, I wonder how I came that close with that many variables and I'm okay, and this keeps sort of happening to me. Is there some sort of a plan, or is it all just up to total random luck flip of a coin? And I never really knew, if that was the case or not. Then I went on to my next job, which was when I was done with the squadron, I ended up back actually on the same ship, which is unusual. So I had a lot of people I knew on the ship, where I found myself running the air traffic control center. And if you look at the ship, you have 85 airplanes on the Independence, and you always have 40 of them in the air. So you have 40 in the air. and the other 40 are getting ready to take off from the catapults. And once they're all in the air, then it's time to land the first 40 that were in the air. And then you get them pulled out of the way, up on the bow, and then the next group, now the deck is cleared for them to land. And this is a pretty high pressure atmosphere that you're in, particularly at night and in bad weather. And in order to manage this, I ran this division. That's me up in the middle of the officers at the top there. I ran the division that ran the air traffic control center. There were 31 people, so this is only a few of the supervisors and so forth. And our job was not to make mistakes, ever. And every night when I was doing this, we did this until 2 o'clock in the morning when flight operations would end. And me and a couple of the other guys, we would go back to the hallway outside of our room, which was a dead end hallway. They called it Sleepy Hollow, and out would come a bottle of scotch, and we would just sit on the floor. Of course, liquor is not allowed on the Navy ship, but, you know. In those days, that's what the safe in your room was for, was to put your alcohol. And we would just sit on the floor, and guys from the squadron would come down. We'd just sit on the floor and just, you know, be glad that we made it through another day. Until one night, there were a number of mistakes made. Everybody had what was called a Charlie time. This is when you come out of holding and you start landing. And it's 20 miles behind the ship, 5,000 feet up, and the Phantom F4s would come in first, and then the A6s and the A7s, because the Phantoms were always running out of gas. They burn a lot of gas in those airplanes. Jet fuel, of course. And when they get to that certain time, that's when they start descending with our air traffic controllers, and they start the landing process. And that's a pretty hairy time. And I have to keep 40 airplanes in my head on a big screen and remember who is who on each airplane and who's experienced and who isn't. So it's really quite a demanding job. And I had some amazing air traffic controllers working for me. If you look at the one in the lower right corner there, his name was Foy. He was just unbelievably good. A lot of great guys down there. A lot of these people were 18 or 19 years old with this kind of, responsibility in their hands, not to screw up. Now, let's say this guy Foy had been telling you about his NDE. Would you want him sitting on that radar scope, being responsible for your life landing on the ship? Well, in those days, I would say you'd have second thoughts, wouldn't you? This is a guy who hallucinates and has funny ideas about another dimension. I don't know. So the culture in this kind of a military establishment is not very open to new thoughts and new ideas. And the other thing that was quite common, I think, about this is that the military is really made up of a couple of different cultures. One is people who've been through, West Point and Annapolis, and they're career people, and this is their life. The other are draft dodgers like me, or so forth, looking for something more interesting to do, but we may or may not decide we love it and we want to be in it for our careers. And so you have a mix of cultures that way in the military, and you can spot these cultures, even the differences from coast to coast. East Coast Navy air is different than West Coast Navy air. And the submarine guys were different. They were, they were wound up differently. And the surface guys were different. And we made fun of each other. And the Marines, for God's sake, they were definitely different. And I don't know what we would have done without them, wanting to protect us. And the other services were different. So now you have a mixture of cultures. And it's a culture which, in that time, didn't like anything that would upend things, upset things at all. And yes, we had cover-ups. We had incidents where people died. Flying the A7, for example. But mainly in flight training where they died, and the instructor had done something you're absolutely not supposed to do. And you learn procedures, and if they'll tell you, well, this is why this guy died, because he did the wrong thing that you've been told not to do, you'd learn from it, but they wouldn't let you do that. They'd cover it up and pretend it was something mechanical or something, or it's being investigated or whatever. And this idea of the cover up started to make me wonder about what's with this culture, okay? For the last 20 years, my neighbor living right next, down the street from me here is retired now, is a Navy surgeon. She used to have patients who would come up as a surgeon that had some close calls and had to be resuscitated. They had NDEs, and I said to her, "What did you do when they started talking?" And she just said to me, "I listened." She's a Catholic, and she's been a part of our NDE group for a couple of years now. And because she saw something different. The other thing that happened in the military was one time as a surgeon, she was covering for another surgeon there who was a senior surgeon. I think he was a commander or a captain, covering for him while he was away for a couple of weeks on leave with one of his patients. And she didn't like the way this situation looked, and she did an MRI. Oh my God, she's got cancer and it's getting very close. And she did an emergency operation. She saved the woman's life, and I've met her since. Well, the other surgeon gets back from vacation and said, "How dare you do what you did? How dare you?" And she said she was going to die. He said, "Well, I know, but instead, you embarrassed the hell out of me. How dare you embarrass me? Well, what would you have had me do? Don't tell her she's got cancer. Just make her comfortable while she's dying." I'm not making this up, okay? And then he even left a death threat on her answering machine. "Don't you ever embarrass me like that again." And she turned it over to the Judge Advocate General's office with a complaint. You know what happened? Nothing. So she said, "The hell with this," and she just made commander, and she resigned from the Navy. And I hate to tell a negative story like this, but I'm trying to tell you that when stuff like this happens, it's pretty hard to be open. Well, then what happened, and I watched this in the Naval Reserve, suddenly the Navy is starting to let women come in. Well, in case you haven't noticed, women are different than men. And so the women tended to be more open-minded, more interested in things like this. And so people who were nurses, for example, were more likely to say, "Hey, why aren't we talking about this NDE stuff? Why aren't we doing it?" We didn't call it NDEs then. There was people who said they'd been to heaven. "Why aren't we talking about it?" And then they were told by people higher up, that, "Oh, it's because, if the person's got PTSD or they need to see the shrink or whatever." On the ship that I was on doing air traffic control, one of the officers told me, "Did you know that our boss believed in reincarnation?" I said, "No, he certainly didn't tell me." And they said, "Well, he doesn't really want anyone to know," right? But the commander who was in charge of their operations, he didn't want anyone to know that he believed in reincarnation. And then this particular officer, I told him once, that I was sort of curious, and we started talking about UFOs, and he said, "When I was on E2, which is a radar early warning plane that protects the fleet, from people coming over the horizon with a big radar screen," he says, "I tracked a target across doing 4,400 miles an hour once, and I reported it." And he said they sent me to see the shrink. And this poor guy never got promoted to lieutenant commander, and he had to get out of the Navy early. He said, I'd never tell anybody again that I saw something like that, because now I'm no longer considered reliable." So that was the culture. The women came in, we went to an all-volunteer service, and the culture started to change. It hasn't changed completely, but I watched it change a bit while I was in the reserves, because there was an officer there who I think he wasn't a pilot like me, but he was an engineering type. And we were at Grumman Aerospace, which was our job of monitoring the contracts. And I remember suddenly he had a wonderful wife and a lovely daughter, and seemed like he had a great life. And finally let us know he was getting divorced. And why? And he said, well, you know, my wife had this sudden stroke and she almost died and blah, blah, blah. But when she came back, she told me this story about how she'd been to heaven and what it was like, and how she completely wasn't in sync with the kind of life we were leading. It was materialistic, it was this, it was that. And she had a completely different outlook, and she wanted me to understand this whole thing. And I finally got to say, to the point where I said, well, this isn't the woman that I married, and we're getting divorced. And I think that was the first time I had somebody I knew that was getting a divorce over something like this. And so as it progressed, I found we were talking about this stuff a little more, and there were certain people in the group you could talk to and certain ones you couldn't. But the thing that was important was this idea of hallucination. And so about this time, of course, you know, Raymond Moody came out with his book in the 70s, and all these people who had been hiding in the closet, think they were the only ones in the world that had an NDE, finally said, oh my God, I'm not the only one. There's all kinds of people out there. Well, now there was a safety in numbers, and they could come out and they could talk. And that included some people in the military. And so as I went through this, the commander of my naval unit, who became the admiral over us when I became the commander of that unit, he was a Catholic, and he was not into all this. He felt the explanations that he needed could be found, you know, in his religion and what he believed in. And I think at that point I said to myself, well, maybe what I have to do is come up with some kind of things I can talk about that are proof, because a lot of these people are, you know, they're trained people, they have analytical minds supposedly. So let's talk about that. So I remember, well, at that point I got divorced after 16 years of marriage. During college, I'd gone with a girl whose father was State Department, her grandfather and her uncle were both admirals. She wasn't ready to marry me, and she went off and married somebody else. So I ended up doing the same thing, only I made a lousy choice. So after 16 years of marriage, I finally got divorced. And I called up her parents and said, well, where is Lena? And they said, well, she's divorced and living in California. So I decided, that's it. I went out there and got her. That was 32 years ago, and I married her, and she's watching the show. The very first thing that happened, she picked me up at the airport in LA. We went and found a restaurant on Redondo Beach on the pier. And we sat down. The first thing she did was tell me that she had an NDE and what it was like. And when she started going through that, how it happened, it was in childbirth in India, which is where she was, with her husband, who was a CIA officer at the embassy there. And is still a friend of ours. And she went out of the room. She saw them working on her body. She went up and saw the earth. And she saw and understood what every single one of those 7 billion people were doing and thinking, and the suffering they were going through. And she had this cosmic knowledge and this feeling of love and peace. And felt like, if I could just tell these people what I see from here, I think they would stop fighting each other and being separated from what we're all a part of. And she realized that she was back home. This is the place that she came from, somewhere up there. And she went back and she had a conversation with the light, like people do. She wanted to stay, like most people do. And she was told, no, I've given you the gift of love. You have more to do on earth. You're going to have to go back. And she was back in her body. Now, this is the first time I'd ever heard something like this in this way from somebody who I definitely believe. So that's when I got more and more interested in this whole NDE thing because I'm not an experienced. Then I had a visit to my father, who my parents were divorced. My mother is dead by now, and he was down at Charleston teaching, psychiatry, running the psychiatry school at MUSC, and then seeing patients. And he started telling me a story about a patient that he had who had a very difficult trauma back in her life, very difficult, and that he finally decided to resort to hypnosis, but he didn't do that. And she had this great fear of fires and this, that, and the other. And he took her back to the source because he couldn't find it in anything in her background. Well, she'd been burned at the stake as a witch in the south of France in the 1600s. She related this entire thing to him fluently in French. She also spoke. But this lady did not speak a word of French, but she did when she was under hypnosis. And she even described the little town that it was and the name of the town. My father went back to the university or the library and said, show me a map of the south of France. I want to find this town. What wasn't there? It didn't exist. And the guy finally said, well, when was this town that you heard about? And he said, oh, it was 1600. He said, well, for God's sakes, you got to look at a 1600 map, you know? So he went and got an old map that the library had, and there was the town. So my father was now at this point saying to me, well, I've always wondered about this, but now I've got some evidence. Reincarnation in some form probably does exist. I think it does, you know. Again, he was open-minded, an analytical mind, and he didn't care if he said, gee, everything I thought yesterday, it turned out is upside down. Today it's different, and tomorrow may be different again. It didn't bother him to do that. But again, that's really not what you think of in the military. So I decided when I'm dealing with my Naval Reserve Group, other people I know, and I want to have something I can say that brings them on board. And I started talking to them a little bit more about it, kind of in a different fashion. And the way I did it was I would start out basically by saying, and let me get this, well, there's 4 reasons why we have an interest in NDEs and STEs and OBEs and all these other things, and this is what they are. First of all, we want to know what's going to happen when we croak. Everybody wants to know that, right? But pretty soon, well, not when you're in college because you're immortal, but eventually you want to know, if you could. The second thing, eventually, after you start losing loved ones, is you wonder what happened to them when they died. And can they see you now, and can you communicate with them? And of course, we all know now that we can. The last 2 things, you're probably not all that interested in at that point. Later on, we start talking now, our souls return to Earth more than once. What are they here for? What are they learning? And then in the end, what's the purpose of our lives and humanity in general? And then we full circle back to this whole issue of when I almost hit the deck on the carrier and all that. How much is planned? How much is luck? How much is random? How does that all work? Which, of course, is a matter of interest that many people have studied. During this period of time, the book came out called If Morning Never Comes, which I thought was the best one I've read on a veteran in the Vietnam War, basically dies in battle, and what he went through and what he did with his life afterwards. So, I mean, I would recommend that. Bill Vandenbush, very interesting book about a very difficult recovery from that whole thing. But I started coming to the position that, okay, look, I'm going to talk to these people and I'm going to give them evidence. And I'm going to rely on their ability as professionals to look at the evidence and say, okay, how did these things happen? For example, Pam Reynolds, who was able to describe everything that happened during her operation and so forth, and what was going on down the hall at the transit station and all these sort of things. Maria's shoe, well-known story of a lady in Seattle who was able to see something drying out on a window ledge of the hospital as she was floating up towards heaven. And when she told them about it, of course, they thought she was full of it, but a couple of the nurses were curious enough to go room to room on another floor until they found a shoe. At that point, okay, how do you explain that if that was a hallucination? How do you? Particularly when she described the outside of the shoe precisely, which you couldn't see from inside the room. Then the shoe story from Hartford, which is the one who saw a red shoe on the roof of the hospital. Okay. And that's a story that really had some traction at the time, because she came back and said, yeah, I know it happened, because when I was floating up there, I looked down, somebody left a red shoe on the roof of the hospital, and there was a resident or intern in the room who thought, okay, this is enough of this nonsense. I gotta prove this is just BS. And he went and got the janitor, and he went up on the roof, and he sheepishly came back with a red shoe in his hand. So that story ended up, I think, with an interview between, I think it was Judy Woodruff and Ken Ring, who did a interview for television on the whole story, because Ken Ring was the psychology professor from the University of Connecticut, who was on the ground floor starting the Association for Near-Death Studies. And then the baby's hip story. I'll just ask Yvonne quickly. I have 20 minutes left, or what have I got? About that? Okay.
About that, yeah. Mhm.
Okay, because I was just looking at the time. Okay. A doctor who in Russia, who had an NDE, was drawn to the maternity ward, came back when he woke up and said, there's a baby in the maternity ward, he's crying, and that poor baby has a broken hip. And because he was a doctor, they finally believed him enough that they went, and there was one baby, unexplained, total crying, and well, finally stopped crying after it met the doctor, because the doctor told the baby telepathically, okay, I know your hip's broken, it'll be taken care of. Because the baby told him, my hip is broken. This is what we find in these cases, is people worry about language. And the only language that I think Yvonne did use when she introduced us saying welcome, was she didn't use telepathy. But that's exactly how they talk. We communicate. The baby said, hey, I've got a broken hip. He said, okay, we'll take care of it. And the baby stopped crying. But at any rate, they went back, they x-rayed the baby, and it had a broken hip. Yeah. How do you explain that with material science? So I've told these things to friends and to people who don't want to believe this stuff, because they don't want to believe something that takes them out of, I think it's their comfort zone. Some people have different comfort zones than others, and certainly in the military, that's a strong point. And some of it's necessary. It's not an easy life. ADCs is what we call those after death communications. There have been so many communications that have been verified with evidence that could not have happened if you weren't really talking to somebody on the other side. They're telling you where something is, where to find it, or some information. There's no way you could get that information. So people have NDEs where, they get met by Uncle Joe and tell everybody, oh no, dear, Uncle Joe just called about you a few days ago. He's fine. And they call him, oh no, Uncle Joe died yesterday. How do you explain that? So I think we go in through this with people and we say, okay, instead of starting out, I want to convince you there's another dimension because I know you don't believe me. You just start out with, I want to tell you some stories and ask you how you think these things could have come about, and then see what they say. And I find that that works out a lot better than starting off with a position or a judgment or a view of it. You just start off with somebody, including somebody who's senior to you in the military, and say, these are stories I've read. What do you think? And see if you can get them thinking, and then you'll find out if they have an open mind or not. And if they don't have an open mind, I say don't waste your time. I mean, I've got a very close friend who's a physicist. Anyone who's his position is this is nonsense and I don't want to hear the evidence. And if you run into that, I think it's time to look elsewhere. But you'll find plenty of people who will talk about it. I think the other place where we've seen real evidence is reincarnation. It's not the same as having a second viewpoint. In terms of the law, in civil court, you have to prove your case in what's called the preponderance of the evidence, as opposed to beyond a reasonable doubt. Preponderance of the evidence means you've got more evidence that what you say is true than somebody else does that you that it isn't. And what the press always used to use in the old days before they'd report a story is they'd want a second confirmation. So if you come to them and say there's a coup in Guatemala going on right now, you don't put it in the paper until you find somebody else who doesn't know this person, who's somewhere else in the picture, who says, yes, there's a coup taking place right now in Guatemala. Otherwise, you don't report it because you need two independent pieces of information. But that's what we have, 2 and 3 and 4 independent sources of information with things like NDEs and ABCs. So, okay, I always ask, all right, what's your explanation for how this is happening if there isn't another dimension? What do you think? It's not hallucination. Reincarnation is a little harder to prove to people in conversation because through hypnosis, you don't know what that person is coming up with from what source, for sure, unless you verify it with facts on the ground. And one story that's been told, if you look it up, is a woman named Mary in the UK who keeps dreaming that she died as a young mother in some house in Ireland, and she remembers what the house looked like and the village looked like. And she wondered if she was reincarnated, and she goes back and finally finds the house, and people say, yeah, there was a young woman who died here. Her sons are still, there's a couple of them that are still around, they're 80 years old or something. And she goes and she meets her 2 sons, and they compare stories about when they were growing up. That's really an off-the-wall, amazing story, where they actually had a reincarnation with an overlap like that. But there it is, okay? So then we get to the more difficult subject. If there's another dimension, does that explain UFOs and alien vehicles? So UFO is simply unidentified, like the 2 stories that I told you earlier on. And those stories are examples of how people just simply got the wrong idea from something that was explainable, and they didn't have any other explanation. Okay. The most famous one is Roswell, and I'll come to that in a moment. The other one is the one that happened in the Pacific. So let's go back to the military. You're in the military, you're out there alone, like I was. You're flying along, you see a flying saucer, you try to intercept it, you can't, you chase it around. It finally flies up and down at a speed that you can't possibly explain or imagine. Then it goes boom underneath the water and zips along underneath the surface of the water, and you're following it. And I guess it realizes you must be able to see it, so it pops up out of the water and goes straight out into outer space. Are you going to come back to the ship and tell them all this alone? But what happened was there were 2 pilots and 2 airplanes together. The airplane that replaced the A-7, which was the A-18, and they had gun cameras on those. We didn't have cameras on ours. They had cameras, video cameras. And the 2 of them chased after this object in the Pacific and saw it do all the things that I just described, and they videoed. And they came back to the ship, and they're both commanders, which are pretty senior to even still be out flying, except for the commanding officer of the squadron is a commander and the executive officer, but everybody else is a lieutenant commander and below. So these guys are pretty senior, and they're saying, hey, this is what we saw. Now, the genie's out of the bottle in the military. This has just been reported by people who are credible. It's too late to decide whether we want to keep it a secret or not. So we may as well somehow face it. So now we hear there's been some department in the Pentagon that's been formed to study all this, which I believe is its own department. The Pentagon's been there for the last 30 years. It's just now they're pretending it's a brand new department because it already existed, right? So those are some of the things that are now starting to open up the story. The one that's not open yet is Roswell. We keep hearing all kinds of conspiracy theories about the crash in Roswell, and really no secondary evidence or proof. But it happens that one of the professors who teaches courses for me in my group, my Circle of Scholars group, I've known him for years and years and years. Retired, he was director of the Los Alamos National Laboratory, which, as we all know, is the one that invented the piano bomb in New Mexico. And we were having lunch one day, and he said, "What's the new course you're teaching?" I said, "Oh, it's what happens when you die." He said, "What? What do you mean?" And I explained it. He said, "Oh my God!" He said, "You know, I had one of those." So we started going through it, and he had the bad judgment to have his heart attack on a steamer. Fortunately, his daughter was with him. It was his 57th birthday, and by the time he got in the ambulance, he had died. And they ultimately brought him back to life. And he had his NDE start attack. So after that took place, the subject of Roswell came up. And he said, "You know, years after, when I had the heart attack, the guy in the bed next to me in the cardiac unit, who had also had it, and I got together for lunch after we got out of the hospital. And he said, when I heard you were, director of the Los Alamos Laboratory, I felt like I could talk to you. I want to tell you something I've never told anybody in my life." He was a deputy sheriff at Roswell, and he was the first one on the scene. And he called for backup, and others showed up, and then the military showed up. The military said, "You guys get the hell out of here." And they said, "No, I'm the sheriff's department, and this is into our jurisdiction. You guys get the hell out of here." And they said, "No, you get out of here." And eventually it got to where they were outnumbered and outgunned by the military people and decided, okay, I guess we better get out of here. So they all left but him, and he hid in the bushes and watched. And he watched while 4 soldiers took 4 stretchers off of that flying saucer with 4 people who were still alive, still writhing in pain and so forth. And off he went. But before they left the scene, the military people said to them, "If you ever breathe a word of this to anybody, you and your families will disappear." Now, normally you don't hear that kind of threat from people in uniform, but that's what they were taught. So he said, "You're the first person I've ever told this to." Well, it happens that somebody else we know, actually in our group here, I have a friend who was a Navy SEAL, which they do a lot of clandestine things, as you know, who was early on the scene at Roswell and tells a story that is the same as what this guy said. Live bodies being taken off on saucer. Now, how did that decision to cover it up get made? is the other big question, because obviously somebody in the military had some training or some position or understanding that when something like this happens, you don't ever let it go out until somebody says it's okay to go out. And they somehow went up the chain of command quickly, and somebody said, legally or otherwise, you clamp down on this, no matter what you have to do. And once that started, it stayed in place. And now it's been a lot of years since Roswell. I think that was what, 1947 or something, a long time ago. And as a result, I think people wonder, well, why did you keep it a secret? We didn't keep the FNA-18 pilot thing secret because it leaked out. It hasn't turned the world upside down, but why'd you keep that secret? And we really don't know. When you think about the culture of the military, it's a couple of things, but one of them is we don't upset the apple cart. Number two is everything should be on a need-to-know basis. You don't need to know, you don't know. And the third is we don't want to find something that we want the Russians to know that we found, particularly in the Cold War. God knows what they would do with this information. And there was a real concern about that. And also, are people ready for it? You know, has mankind evolved enough that it's ready enough to understand that there could be people from some other part of the galaxy, and they absolutely mean us no harm. The military thinks first about how can they harm us and how can we stop them from doing it, because that's their job, right? So that's kind of what took place there. So as we look further into this, we find out, yes, the military was worried about this. The Pentagon was, Department of Defense, National Security Agency, CIA, all were, and they went and decided we need to do some research into this. And they hired Stanford University, and the program was run by Dr. Russell Targ, who has had to keep this quiet all these years. And only a few years ago was he finally able to, you know, come out of the shadows and say, okay, this is some of the stuff that we've studied. And you can Google Russell Targ and it'll show, you can, I think, probably still see on YouTube a half-hour talk that he gives on studying the ability of psychics and non-local consciousness and all the things that we talk about. I mean, think about it. I mean, there was a kind of a rumor at the time where the Russians were working on this kind of thing. Now, imagine if the Russians developed a spying mechanism where they could go take a consciousness and then take it 5,000 miles away and stick it in the middle of the Pentagon and find out everything it wants and then come back with it. Well, that's pretty scary. So obviously they didn't want to get caught with their pants down, so they wanted to do a study on it. So they did this at Stanford. And they did a lot of studies, all of which showed that, yes, it's possible not only for consciousness to exist outside of the body and to do what's called non-local viewing, where you can go and look at something 10 miles away and come back and describe it, but people can actually mess around with time, make time go forward and time go back. And that again is another sign that, yes, there has been evidence that all of this has taken place, and yes, it is possible for there to be another dimension. Hard for the military to ignore it now because their people were involved in these studies. Another is, usually, of course, the onset of the findings of quantum mechanics, which I think is more accurately called quantum electromechanics, but experiments that have been done there saying, in effect, physical objects, like an atom or a proton, can be cut in half. And you take one of the halves thousands of miles away, and if you turn one of them, the other one turns opposite. They turn together at the same time, like twins. How is that possible? Something that Einstein described as spooky things happening at a distance. So again, you've got that. The other is, well, can people share this kind of thing? What happens if you share this consciousness? Does this help society evolve? Well, for that, you can Google Rupert Sheldrake and his studies that were done by rats, about rats in the 1930s, that were later duplicated in Australia, which shows you can teach rats how to swim through arrays and they will share this with the rats on another continent. That's eerie, isn't it? Very interesting stuff. And then you say, okay, there is something out there that's bigger than us, and you know, what are we going to say about it? So I think all of this is slowly coming around. I think we need to start with questions instead of conclusions when we talk to people in the military about this stuff. You know, what do you think is behind it? And let them scratch their heads a little until they finally realize, I guess there's no other explanation. And make it unfrightening, I guess, is the other thing that you want to do. Obviously, human evolution is another story that's probably beyond that, but are humans sharing what they learned in each reincarnation the way they're making this a better world, at least in some slow progress? And of course, people will say, well, why can't it be faster? But it is what it is. So I think all of these things can be dealt with. I think it's getting easier. I think the military, you know, has got to be supported in a culture that makes them tough at fighting, but soft about talking about things like us and this kind of experience. Because these are people who are really out there risking their lives to fight wars that they didn't start, to protect us and to protect our way of life. And they need the support that they're not always getting, whether it's from PTSD or other problems that they have from dealing with very scary and difficult to assimilate situations. Yeah, the human mind, when consciousness is within your brain, it has a very limited ability to do things compared to when it's outside your brain because your brain dies. So within your brain, you know, you have issues when you see horrible things happening, and it's part of your job. That's what you got to do. So they need support from the people that they protect, I think, in order to make them more comfortable about all that in the big picture. I always like to have somebody have the last word, but we don't have it. Is there a plan?
Yeah,
And if there's a plan, what's the point of looking both ways if you cross the street? Because if it's in the plan for you to get run over, you will be, and if it won't, it won't. Well, that's not true. There's free will in all of this plan, because if there's not free will, what's the point of living? And is there some kind of joint learning going on? And is there a human evolution going on? So I think that's what we're really looking at. In the end, the last word to me is a comment by William James, who's the brother of the novelist Henry James, that we've all heard of. He was a philosopher. And he's the one who said, our science is a drop, our ignorance is a seed. This at least is certain. The world of our present natural knowledge is enveloped in a larger world of some sort. Thank you for your time.
Ben, thank you so much. If I can get you to stop sharing on your screen. There we go. All right. I found it insightful. You know, the source of information is important to help us give credibility to all these extraordinary experiences people are sharing. And you gave some today that are new to me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to chat and share some of the questions with you. You've got an advocate out there that gave a possible answer. See if you can see how they resonate with you. You were talking about the Pacific FA-18 UFO incident. Can you tell us what year that was?
Oh, it's recent. It's in the last couple of years.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think if you Google it, it's West Coast. I forget the name of the ship. Because they were, I think these F-18 pilots were out of San Diego, Miramar or something. And there was a ship out there that said, we need to take a look at this thing. But if you just put in, F-18 UFO sighting Pacific, you'll get some readings on it.
Okay, but the one you were referring to was the two commanders, right? Because
Yeah.
there's another comment here from somebody about some sightings off the Virginia Capes with
Okay,
the
that's-
US Atlantic Fleet.
That's different. Yeah, that's different.
Okay. So it sounds like if we Google, we might find more already because folks are taking it to public social media now.
Yep.
All right, of interest for the Roswell craft. What did the beings look like that were removed from that craft? Did he share that with you?
They were smaller than us, maybe 4 feet. No clothing or uniforms on them, and sort of a, I don't know, darkish color. Now, we don't know if because of their being so far ahead of us, I guess, in evolution, if they're able to change their appearance or whatever else, but that's what they look like. They're about 4 feet long. And they weren't wearing some kind of clothing you recognize. Do you agree with that, Robert, from what your friend told you?
Yes, you're exactly right. Thank you, Ben. Thanks for asking.
Okay. Yes, of the gray type, that's one of the other comments was they appear to be like the grays, which are commonly referred to on television stories. Do you think true public disclosure will be happening anytime soon? This is from Tim.
Well, it depends on what you mean by true or whether it's complete public exposure. I would not expect anything official about it. I mean, there is a military defense risk in technology that if somebody gets it, like nuclear weapons, that we got it before anybody else. If we had bad designs in the world, we could do some horrible things until somebody else got them. And so I think there will be a tendency on the military, if they find anything that has a military application, that they're going to keep it under wraps. But if something happens that they have to explain because, one of them lands in the middle of Mardi Gras one year, I mean, you're not going to be able to cover it up. And I think that could happen as well.
Yeah, and I'm just going to write on top of that, the disclosures being made through Ancient Aliens, they're just so profound that a lot of our general public is accepting the reality, even if it's not taken in as public disclosure. So
Yeah.
Just adding that into what you've already given witness to. Let me see. What is, this is from Chuck, and it's a comment, but it was interesting. It's called AA Tip, was the latest attempt to release selective information. It seems that the government's willingness to disclose or acknowledge ebbs and flows is, as military personnel, do you get advised on when and where you might disclose any of this information? Of course, you're retired, so.
Well, I wasn't privy to this. The things that I was privy to in the military, they're things that in our debriefing, we were told, until you hear otherwise, you take it to the grave with you.
Hmm.
some things get declassified automatically after a certain period of time. Some are not subject to automatic declassification. I had a top secret crypto clearance, which gives you access to anything you need to know, but it doesn't give you something that you only want to know because you're curious, which is the way you protect classified information. The more people know something, the more chance that it'll leak out. So I was privy to something that only 6 people in the Pentagon knew about, and it's still secret today. So, but I know why, and therefore I would never tell anybody about it. So, whereas some of it, you say, well, why is this secret? If it's just because you want to protect somebody's ego, come on, guys, that's not reasonable. And I think there's a tendency to overclassify, in some areas.
Okay. In your introduction, the term OLLI was used. Can you tell us what OLLI is?
Oh, OLLI's the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. It's founded by a very wealthy guy named Osher from California, who thought that people who were retired should have a place that they can go back and study things like they missed when they were in college because they were too busy thinking about the opposite sex. And besides, they wanted to get a degree and they wanted to go out and get a job and get the hell going. And then you get to being a retiree, and you have a whole lot more curiosity. And I think there are 60 or 70 OLLIs at various universities around the country where they've turned over their like the University of Rhode Island has, where they turned over their facilities, and you might have 30, 40 classes going. The one that I ran was at Salve Regina University. It wasn't an OLLI, it was independent of that. But, we had 30, 40, we had 700 members. We had classes going all the time, and they'd be in stuff like this, but not like this, because Salve Regina, they weren't interested in the NDEs, at all. But anyway, they would let you teach a course on Islam, even though it was a Catholic university. But when I told them Mary Neal was eager to come here and chat in their auditorium, when I talked to her about it, they said, oh, no. So anyway, that was the end of that. But the one at URI is got, I think, 1,100 members now, and a lot of them are retired professors who still want to teach, and a lot of them are retired people who have never taught, always knew they would like to, and they might be good at it. So I'd say there's about an even split. And and I use a lot of Naval War College professors here locally to teach courses, in foreign affairs and history and so forth in my courses. And I also use, university professors. But the university professors always say, oh, God, I really prefer teaching your lifelong learning stuff because I don't have to worry about kids, texting during my goddamn class. They are listening, they are arguing with me, they are asking questions of me, they want to hear more. They make great students. So every state, I think, has at least one OLLI in it. Osher Lifelong Learning.
Thank you. That's a thorough explanation. Just want to let you know, when I'm going to share the chat with you afterwards, you got an advocate in the audience, and his name is Chuck. He's also a retired naval officer.
Name is what?
Chuck.
Chuck.
Chuck Radar. So, okay, a lot of comments. So I'm trying.
That's all right.
All right. Would it most likely be revealed if and only if it furthers the agenda of 2030 or whatever the aims of the plan currently underway are? I think they're Shala's looking for what would tempt anybody to reveal more about the reality of UFOs.
I think from the government's perspective, you always have two risks. One is you give somebody information that puts you more at risk and less at risk. So you certainly don't want to do that. If you develop a new weapon system, like the hypersonic missile or something like that, for sure you broadcast it because it helps, warn your competitors in the world not to mess with you because, you're up to date, and so don't be tempted. The other problem you have is if revealing the information might reveal the source of the information. And you don't want to do that because they might figure out, well, the only way they could have found this out is there's a mole in our organization, or there's, somebody in such a department that we have to root out because that's where this information wants to come from. So you have to worry about that. The qualitative part is this going to upset people or make people feel less secure in a time in which, this is a time when most people have felt the most insecure in their lives. I think the answer would probably be they'd be pretty conservative about doing it.
Okay. Well, Ben, I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us. You're a great indication that even people trained to be on the straight and narrow can have an open mind to the realities of the spiritual essence of our lives. And you were courageous to even open the dialogue while you were on active duty. So I'm waiting to see if there might be another question. I think we're wrapping this up. I did want to mention that you have a special
Sorry, Linda,
credential in your lineup.
there are a couple more questions. Mhm.
Okay.
I think Tamara had one.
In that you married an experiencer, so you are living with the reality of spiritually transformative experiences on a daily basis.
Right.
So, okay, so we do have some more questions. This is from Tim. If you are allowed to say, what do you personally believe at this time after all your experience?
Well, I'm not sure, believe about what, believe about if it's NFOs or NDEs or what. I believe that there is another dimension. I mean, not that many years ago, I could have proven the earth was flat. And if it was round, people would fall off the other side. You can't see gravity. And I can't prove to you there's no such thing as a black swan by telling you that I've never seen one. That's not evidence. And when you suddenly discover that the sun rotates around the earth instead of the other way around, well, that didn't help the career of the poor guy that discovered it. I know there's another dimension. And if there's another one dimension, there may be multiple other dimensions. I know full well that if I'm watching the I Love Lucy show, if I rip open my TV, I'm not going to find Lucille Ball and Daisy Arnaz inside of it. They're somehow in this room, and they're being tuned into at a certain frequency, okay, that's producing this picture and this sound, and that's all our brain is doing. That I definitely believe in. Our brain does not create thought. It has instincts in it, food, sex, sleep, protection, but it does not create thought. That is part of a consciousness or a soul or whatever you want to name it that occupies us like a driver occupies a car and drives it till the car wears out. And it goes somewhere else. And I believe that it is part of a universe that we are all a part of. And I also believe there may be a creator like a light or a God figure or something that's organized this. And I also believe that might not be true, that every single one of us is God. And we're all equal, and we're all part of the same, whatever it was that happened in a billionth of a second. But I just think it's the tip of the iceberg, and I'm not going to find out in my lifetime, but I'll find out afterwards.
True. Final exit, we all get the right answers, right? After the test is reviewed. So this is from Grant. He says, great insights, Ben. How have you and your wife been able to get closer to spirit, knowing what you both know now?
Well, I would say yes. I think we both have, because we live in the real world where we have challenges, you know, family, sickness, illness, successes and failures. And I think because of that, we figured out that we're probably in the same soul group. That we decided to meet up here when we were reincarnated this time, but you know, we figured that's probably the case. And so we figured that we'll still be together on the other side. And I don't think you get any closer than I am with her and she is with me. But you know, and I think that would have been true even if we'd been married before she had her NDA. So.
Okay. Next one is from Tamara, and she says, Ben, do you know if we made a deal during the Eisenhower years with the reptilians and gray alien races, technology for testing humans?
Is technology protecting us? I don't.
Yeah,
think
for testing us, yeah.
testing us. Are we being tested? You know, if you look at what Robert and Suzanne Mays did, the Vines, you know, they did a study of people who had NDEs and saw the future. Okay. They saw Civil War, they saw this, they saw that. But then they were all people who kind of thought that before they had their NDE. But they said, you know, they think man was given nuclear weapons in order to test his ability to choose between good and evil. And if he chooses evil, it'll blow him off the face of the earth and we'll plant some other kind of living thing on the planet Earth. And sorry, it didn't work out, folks. When Evan Alexander talks about it, he says we're entering the age of Aquarius and everything we're learning about the future is things are going to be wonderful. I don't have a clue. But I do think that free will is there. And if you test it, is your free will going to give enough people the right way to realize that they are not separated like they think from each other and from the universe of which they are a part, and that the universe is really one overall by love. And if they start understanding that we will evolve into a successful society. If they fail that test, then they won't. So in a way, I would agree, maybe it is a test. Does that answer it or not? I'm not sure if I hit the spot or missed the point.
Kind of hard. There was a little bit of a question there. What do you think about the theory that during the Eisenhower years, we made a deal with the reptilians and the Greys?
Yeah, I don't think during the Eisenhower years that we made a deal. Like that necessarily, just based on the kind of person that Eisenhower was, but I could be wrong. But I think that's far-fetched unless we come up with some evidence to indicate that. I mean, I don't know how that deal would work.
Okay. Well, Ben, I want to acknowledge again that as a retired naval officer, you dealt with the stringent controls of physics, energy. You had to follow those rules. I could just imagine your feeling taking that aircraft down on the aircraft carrier. Yet your presentation shares with all of us that as a collective force, we have something in common. It's not just the book learner on spiritual experiences. It's the people that live life day to day, that when we experience something, we need to have the courage to share it. And we appreciate you coming online today to do so.
Well, thank you for having me.
So at this point, I'm going to turn this over to our VP, Robert Baer.
And I'd like to piggyback on what Linda said. Ben, you did an absolutely fabulous job. Great presentation. Thank you. And I want to say a couple things to reinforce what you said. I'm a retired policeman, 23 years. This is also for first responders also. Just like you, just like the military. If you have an NDE, it's a very difficult, or know anybody or want to talk about NDEs, it's very difficult to talk to anybody in that line of work and not have it appear like there's something wrong with you. I know Spiritual Awakenings International, for example, with our sharing circles, has opened up dialogue. There's been policemen, retired policemen in the sharing circles that have actually felt comfortable finally having a venue to share their experiences. There's also some military too. So thank you for that. The other thing I want to say is I know personally of someone who experienced what you mentioned about threats to not only themselves, but their families if they disclosed anything. It's real, it happens. And for bringing that out, I just want to reinforce that I know someone that's had that happen. So thank you for having the courage to say that. A couple things for closing remarks. Again, Ben, outstanding job. Spiritual Awakenings International always presents online speaker events on the third Saturday each month. And our next one will be Saturday, December 18th. Tamara Calder Richardson, and you'll see her, she's in the audience here, is going to speak on Seeking Heaven, My 6 NDEs and Other Phenomena. It'll be a great presentation. She has a podcast called the Seeking Heaven podcast. So she's really good at making presentations. She'll do a great job for SAI. Also, back to the Experiencers Sharing Circle. Spiritual Awakenings International is hosting our next SAI Experiencers Sharing Circle on Saturday, December 4th. And we will be having the SAI Experiences Sharing Circles the first Saturday of each month. In addition, we are expanding. We are in 63 countries. We have a huge Espanol following. We will launch Spanish language experiencers sharing circles Saturday, December 11th, 2021. And the Spanish Espanol language events will be the second Saturday of every month. And we had a tremendous presentation by Francisco Valentin just last week. It was just wonderful. And it was in Espanol. Please register for all events and sharing circles on our SAI website. And please check out our beautiful SAI website. There's lots of information on STEs. And if you've not yet subscribed, please do so. Go to www.spiritualawakeningsinternational.org and register and subscribe. And if you feel like it, donate. Anything you can do would help. And thank you once again, Ben. Thank you everybody for coming. I'd like to turn this over to Dr. Kaysan to close it out. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Thank you.
Well, thank you everybody for coming, and thank you, Ben, for your awesome presentation. I want to let everybody know that the video of this presentation and all our other SAI presentations are posted on our SAI website. Just go to the videos tab, and usually they are up at about 2 or 3 days after the event. This was also live streamed on Facebook. So if you're eager to have your friends watch it right away, you go to the Spiritual Awakenings International page on Facebook and you can watch it right away. And eventually they all get posted on our SAI YouTube channel. So if you're on YouTube, go and subscribe to our SAI YouTube channel and you'll get notices of when we post new things. As Robert mentioned, Spiritual Awakenings International is a donation-based organization, and we invite you all at this time of Thanksgiving and as the year is coming to the end, if you feel so moved to help ensure all our SAI events remain free, please give us a donation, which is on the donation page on our website. So with that, I'd like to say goodbye, everyone, until next time. Until we meet again, au revoir, auf Wiedersehen, adieu, hasta la vista, arrivederci, dag, farewell, ciao, and aloha. Bye, everyone. Till next time.